My name is Kimberly Hayes. I'm 28 years old. And when I politely declined to share my $1.2 million inheritance from my grandmother Eleanor with my financially irresponsible mother Carol, she called an emergency family meeting that turned out to be a coordinated legal ambush designed to pressure me into signing over my inheritance to a family trust she would control, complete with 3 hired attorneys and my entire extended family surrounding me with emotional manipulation and threats. What my mother didn't know was that her elaborate inheritance theft scheme was about to backfire spectacularly, because I had anticipated this exact scenario and brought my own team of inheritance protection specialists who had been documenting her illegal pressure tactics and building a comprehensive case against her attempted fraud. The inheritance that would ultimately expose my mother's true character and destroy our family relationships had come from my grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, the most principled and generous woman I had ever known, who had specifically designated her life savings to ensure that I could pursue my dream of becoming a physician without the crushing debt that destroyed so many medical students' career flexibility and personal freedom. Grandmother Eleanor had been a registered nurse for 45 years, working her way up from bedside care to hospital administration, while carefully saving every possible dollar to create financial security that could benefit future generations of her family. She understood both the importance of medical education and the devastating impact that student loan debt could have on young doctors who wanted to serve underserved populations, rather than prioritizing high-paying specialties. "Kimberly, I want you to become the doctor I never had the opportunity to be," Grandmother Eleanor had told me during one of our last conversations before her death from pancreatic cancer 6 months earlier. "This money represents 45 years of nursing work, and I can't think of any better investment than ensuring that my granddaughter can heal people without worrying about crushing debt that would force her to make career decisions based on money rather than calling." The inheritance wasn't just money. It was my grandmother's life's work transformed into educational opportunity and professional freedom. She had been incredibly specific about her intentions, both in her formal will and in countless conversations where she emphasized that the funds were designated exclusively for my medical education, residency support, and the financial independence that would allow me to practice medicine according to my values rather than financial pressure. My acceptance to medical school at Johns Hopkins had been the culmination of years of academic preparation, volunteer work at free clinics, and research projects focused on improving healthcare access for rural and underserved communities. The $1.2 million inheritance would cover tuition, living expenses, medical equipment, and even provide a foundation for the nonprofit medical clinic I planned to establish after completing my residency training. But from the moment my grandmother's will was read, my mother Carol had viewed my inheritance not as educational opportunity, but as family money that should be redistributed according to her financial needs and spending preferences, rather than respecting my grandmother's explicit wishes about supporting my medical career. Carol's immediate reaction to learning about my inheritance had been both revealing and disappointing, demonstrating that she saw my grandmother's generous educational gift as an opportunity to solve her own financial problems rather than celebrating my upcoming medical school enrollment. "Kimberly, we need to talk about this inheritance situation," Carol had said during the phone call that came just hours after the will reading. "$1 million is a huge amount of money, and I think we should discuss how to handle it responsibly as a family rather than having you make decisions independently about such a large sum." The characterization of my grandmother's specific educational bequest as something that required family decision-making rather than individual management had immediately raised red flags about Carol's understanding of both inheritance law and my grandmother's clearly stated intentions. "Mom, Grandmother Eleanor was very specific about wanting this money to support my medical education," I had replied, hoping to remind her of our grandmother's explicit wishes and the legal documentation that supported them. "She saved this money specifically to ensure I could become a doctor without debt, and she was very clear that this was her intended use for these funds." "Your grandmother was elderly and probably didn't fully understand the family implications of such a large inheritance," Carol had responded, dismissing both my grandmother's mental capacity and her clearly articulated wishes. $1 million could help the entire family, not just fund your expensive medical school dreams. We need to think about what's best for everyone, not just what sounds good to someone who wasn't thinking clearly about family needs. The casual dismissal of my grandmother's competence and judgment, combined with Carol's characterization of my medical school plans as expensive dreams rather than professional education, had revealed her complete disregard for both my grandmother's intentions and my own educational aspirations. Carol's arguments for redistributing my inheritance had become increasingly demanding and manipulative over the weeks following the will reading, revealing financial desperation and entitlement that made it clear she viewed my grandmother's educational gift as the solution to problems created by her own irresponsible spending and poor financial decisions. Kimberly, you need to understand that this money could solve so many family problems, Carol had continued during multiple phone calls that became progressively more aggressive. I could pay off my credit card debt, help your Uncle Tom with his mortgage, and still have plenty left for your education. We could structure it as a family investment where everyone benefits, instead of just you hoarding wealth while other family members struggle. The suggestion that honoring my grandmother's educational bequest constituted hoarding wealth, while using it to pay Carol's credit card debt would constitute family investment, had demonstrated Carol's complete inability to understand either inheritance law or the moral obligations that came with respecting my grandmother's specific wishes. When I continued to politely but firmly decline Carol's increasingly demanding requests to redistribute my inheritance, her responses had escalated from disappointed persuasion to angry accusations that revealed her true feelings about my educational goals and my grandmother's wisdom in protecting educational funding from family financial pressure. "You're being incredibly selfish about this inheritance, Kimberly," Carol had said during our final phone conversation before the emergency family meeting. "Your grandmother obviously didn't understand how much this money could help the entire family, and you're choosing to be greedy instead of generous. This attitude doesn't reflect how we raised you to think about family obligations and sharing resources with people who need help." The accusation that respecting my grandmother's educational wishes constituted selfishness, while stealing inheritance money designated for medical education would represent generosity, had made it clear that Carol was either completely deluded about inheritance law or was deliberately attempting to manipulate me into violating my grandmother's explicit instructions. But Carol's final statement during that conversation had revealed the depths of her entitlement and her willingness to use family pressure and manipulation to steal money that had been legally and morally designated for my educational future. "Kimberly, I'm calling an emergency family meeting for this Sunday," Carol had announced, her tone suggesting that this wasn't a request, but rather a command that she expected me to obey without question. "This inheritance situation has gone on long enough, and we need to resolve it as a family before it destroys our relationships. Everyone will be there, and we're going to work out a fair solution that considers everyone's needs rather than just your selfish desires." The characterization of honoring my grandmother's educational bequest as selfish desires and the demand for a fair solution that would redistribute money away from its intended educational purpose had made it clear that Carol was planning some kind of coordinated family pressure campaign designed to force me to violate my grandmother's explicit wishes. Have you ever received an ultimatum from family members who wanted to steal money that was legally and morally yours, while claiming their theft would represent fairness and family unity? That's exactly what I was facing as Carol planned her emergency family meeting to pressure me into abandoning my medical education dreams for the sake of solving her financial problems. But Carol's aggressive approach and her reference to involving the entire family in pressuring me to redistribute my inheritance had also given me crucial advance warning that allowed me to prepare comprehensive legal protection against exactly the kind of inheritance theft that she was apparently planning to attempt. The emergency family meeting that Carol had demanded would indeed resolve the inheritance situation, but not in the way she expected or intended. The background to Carol's desperate attempt to steal my inheritance revealed a decades-long pattern of financial irresponsibility and entitlement that had created the crisis situation driving her increasingly aggressive demands for access to money that my grandmother had specifically protected from exactly this kind of family pressure. Carol's financial problems weren't the result of temporary setbacks or unexpected emergencies. They were the predictable consequences of 30 years of impulsive spending, poor financial planning, and a consistent pattern of living beyond her means while expecting other family members to subsidize her lifestyle choices and bail her out of self-created crises. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, I had watched Carol accumulate credit card debt for luxury purchases, vacation travel, and home renovations that she couldn't afford, followed by dramatic family meetings where she would demand financial assistance from my grandmother, my father, or other relatives who were more responsible with money. "We just need help getting back on our feet," Carol would say during these periodic financial crises, as if her spending problems were temporary difficulties rather than ongoing character issues that created perpetual money problems. "Once we get caught up on these bills, we'll be much more careful about budgeting and won't need family assistance anymore." But Carol's promises to be more careful about budgeting were never followed by actual changes in her spending behavior or financial decision-making. Within months of receiving family financial assistance, she would be accumulating new debt and creating fresh crises that required additional bailouts from relatives who were tired of her repeated failures to learn from previous mistakes. My grandmother Eleanor had been Carol's most frequent source of financial rescue over the years, providing tens of thousands of dollars in loans, gifts, and direct bill payments that had enabled Carol's irresponsible lifestyle while teaching her that family members would always be available to solve problems created by her poor choices. "Your mother never learned to live within her means because people kept rescuing her from the consequences of her spending," my grandmother had confided to me during one of our conversations about family financial dynamics. "I contributed to this problem by giving her money whenever she got into trouble, but I realize now that helping her avoid accountability just made her irresponsibility worse." My grandmother's growing understanding of how financial enablement had contributed to Carol's problems had influenced her decision to structure my inheritance in ways that would support education and personal development, rather than simply providing money that could be wasted on impulsive purchases or used to pay debts created by poor financial planning. The specific legal language in my grandmother's will had been carefully crafted to ensure that the inheritance could only be used for educational expenses, medical training, and professional development activities that would create long-term value rather than being diverted to pay off credit card debt or fund lifestyle expenses that wouldn't benefit my future career prospects. This inheritance is designated exclusively for Kimberly's medical education, residency support, and the establishment of her medical practice, the will had stated explicitly. Under no circumstances should these funds be used for general family financial assistance, debt payments unrelated to educational expenses, or any purpose other than supporting Kimberly's development as a physician and her future service to medical patients. The legal restrictions on my inheritance use weren't just moral guidelines. They were binding legal requirements that would make any attempt to redistribute the money for non-educational purposes a violation of my grandmother's explicit testamentary wishes and potentially grounds for inheritance fraud charges. But Carol's understanding of inheritance law was apparently as poor as her financial planning skills, because her demands for access to my educational inheritance had consistently ignored both the legal restrictions and the moral obligations that came with respecting my grandmother's specific intentions about supporting medical education. Carol's most recent financial crisis, which had triggered her increasingly desperate demands for access to my inheritance, had been created by her decision to refinance her house to fund a luxury kitchen renovation, followed by the accumulation of $47,000 in credit card debt for furniture, travel, and shopping expenses that she couldn't afford on her administrative salary. "I thought the house refinancing would provide enough money for both the renovation and some extra cushion for expenses," Carol had explained when her latest financial problems became apparent. "But the renovation costs were higher than expected, and then we had some other expenses that put us behind on payments. Now the credit card companies are demanding payment, and I don't have enough income to cover all these bills." The revelation that Carol had borrowed against her house to fund luxury renovations, then accumulated massive credit card debt for additional non-essential expenses, had demonstrated the same pattern of financial irresponsibility that had created problems throughout her adult life. But this time, instead of approaching my grandmother for another bailout, Carol was facing the reality that her previous source of financial rescue was no longer available, and the money that might have solved her problems was now legally protected for my educational use rather than being available for her debt payments. Carol's growing desperation about her financial situation had made her increasingly aggressive about demanding access to my inheritance, apparently believing that her crisis gave her some kind of moral claim to money that had been specifically designated for my medical education and professional development. "Kimberly, you have to understand that this is an emergency situation," Carol had said during one of her more manipulative conversations about the inheritance. "I could lose my house if I can't get caught up on these payments, while you're sitting on more than $1 million that you won't even need for medical school for another few months. Family members should help each other during emergencies, especially when they have resources available." The characterization of my respect for my grandmother's educational wishes as sitting on money, while Carol's self-created financial crisis constituted an emergency that justified stealing educational inheritance, had revealed her complete inability to understand both the legal and moral issues involved in inheritance respect. But Carol's reference to the emergency family meeting had suggested that she was planning to escalate her pressure tactics beyond individual manipulation, to include coordinated family pressure designed to overwhelm my resistance to violating my grandmother's explicit wishes about educational funding. The advance warning provided by Carol's aggressive approach had given me crucial time to consult with inheritance protection attorneys who understood both the legal requirements for respecting testamentary wishes and the tactics commonly used by family members who attempt to steal money that has been legally designated for specific purposes. "Ms. Hayes, what your mother is attempting represents a classic pattern of inheritance pressure that we see frequently in cases involving educational bequests," Attorney Patricia Williams had explained during my consultation about inheritance protection. Family members who are facing financial problems often view educational inheritance as unused money that could solve their immediate needs, but inheritance law provides strong protections against exactly this kind of family pressure. Working with Attorney Williams, I had prepared comprehensive legal documentation that would protect my inheritance from family pressure, while also gathering evidence of Carol's attempted inheritance manipulation that could support criminal charges if her pressure tactics escalated to fraud or coercion. The emergency family meeting that Carol had demanded would indeed resolve the inheritance situation, but it would also expose her illegal pressure tactics, while demonstrating that inheritance law provides serious protections for educational bequests against family members who attempt to steal money designated for specific educational purposes. Have you ever had family members plan coordinated pressure campaigns to steal money that was legally yours while claiming their theft would represent family unity and fairness? That's exactly what Carol was attempting, but it was also exactly what would trigger comprehensive legal consequences that she had never anticipated or understood. The emergency family meeting would become Carol's education about inheritance law and the serious penalties for attempting to pressure family members into violating explicit testamentary wishes. The emergency family meeting that Carol had orchestrated revealed itself to be a carefully planned ambush the moment I walked into my parents' house and discovered not just extended family members, but also 3 professional attorneys who had clearly been hired to provide legal pressure and intimidation designed to force me into signing away my inheritance to a family trust that Carol would control. The living room had been rearranged to create a formal meeting atmosphere, with chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a single seat that was obviously intended for me, while a conference table displayed legal documents, calculators, and official-looking papers that suggested extensive preparation for what Carol had characterized as a simple family discussion about inheritance fairness. My uncles Tom and David, Aunt Patricia, and several cousins were all present, their serious expressions and formal positioning making it clear that this wasn't a casual family gathering, but rather a coordinated intervention designed to pressure me into abandoning my grandmother's educational wishes in favor of Carol's financial demands. "Kimberly, thank you for coming," Carol said with false warmth as she gestured toward the isolated chair that had been prepared for me. "We've asked everyone to be here today because this inheritance situation has become too important for individual decision-making. We need to work together as a family to find a solution that benefits everyone, rather than just one person." The characterization of honoring my grandmother's explicit educational bequest as benefiting just one person, while violating her wishes to pay Carol's debts would benefit everyone, revealed the twisted logic that had driven Carol to organize this legal ambush against her own daughter. But the most shocking aspect of Carol's setup was the presence of 3 attorneys, who had clearly been briefed about the inheritance situation, and were prepared to provide professional legal pressure to support Carol's attempts to steal money that had been designated for my medical education. "Kimberly, I'd like you to meet attorneys Robert Martinez, Jennifer Chen, and Michael Thompson," Carol announced, gesturing toward the legal professionals who were positioned behind the conference table like prosecutors preparing to interrogate a defendant. "They've prepared some documentation that will help us structure this inheritance in a way that protects everyone's interests while ensuring that family needs are addressed appropriately." The implication that my grandmother's educational bequest required restructuring to address family needs was both legally wrong and morally outrageous. But the presence of hired attorneys suggested that Carol was prepared to use professional legal intimidation to pressure me into violating my grandmother's explicit wishes. Attorney Robert Martinez took the lead in presenting Carol's inheritance theft scheme, using legal terminology and professional authority to make their demands sound like legitimate inheritance planning rather than attempted fraud designed to steal educational money for debt payments. "Ms. Hayes, we've prepared documentation for a family trust structure that would provide better management and distribution of your grandmother's bequest," Martinez announced, spreading legal papers across the conference table with obvious preparation and professionalism. "This approach ensures that inheritance funds are used for maximum family benefit, while still supporting your educational goals through managed distributions." The euphemistic language about maximum family benefit and managed distributions was clearly designed to disguise the fact that Carol wanted control over my inheritance money, so she could use it to pay her credit card debts, while providing me with whatever small amount she deemed appropriate for medical school expenses. The trust structure we've prepared provides comprehensive financial management that protects large inheritances from impulsive spending while ensuring that family members with immediate needs can receive appropriate assistance, Attorney Jennifer Chen added, apparently reading from prepared talking points designed to make inheritance theft sound like responsible financial planning. But the legal documents they were presenting revealed the true nature of Carol's scheme: comprehensive transfer of my inheritance into a family trust, with Carol as the sole trustee, giving her complete control over how the money would be distributed while removing my ability to use my grandmother's educational gift, according to her explicit wishes. The trust documents included provisions that would allow Carol to distribute inheritance money for family emergencies, debt consolidation, and general family support, while my access to educational funding would require Carol's approval and would be limited to amounts she deemed reasonable and necessary for medical school expenses. This trust structure provides much better financial protection than individual inheritance management, Attorney Michael Thompson explained, clearly trying to convince me that losing control of my grandmother's educational gift would somehow be beneficial for my financial security. Young people often make poor decisions about large inheritances, and family trust management ensures that money is preserved for long-term benefit rather than being wasted on impulsive purchases. The irony of suggesting that I might waste inheritance money on impulsive purchases, while Carol wanted to use it to pay debts created by her own impulsive spending, was apparently lost on the attorneys who were helping her steal educational funding designated for medical training. But the most manipulative aspect of Carol's legal ambush was the coordinated family pressure campaign that had been designed to overwhelm my resistance through emotional manipulation and accusations that portrayed my respect for my grandmother's wishes as selfishness and family betrayal. "Kimberly, you're tearing this family apart by being greedy about this inheritance," my Uncle Tom announced, clearly delivering prepared statements designed to make me feel guilty about honoring my grandmother's educational bequest. "Your grandmother never intended for money to divide us, and your selfish attitude is destroying family relationships that took decades to build. Keeping all that money for yourself while family members are struggling shows that you don't really care about anyone but yourself," my Aunt Patricia added, using the emotional manipulation tactics that Carol had apparently coordinated to pressure me into signing away my inheritance rights. The accusation that honoring my grandmother's specific educational wishes constituted keeping money for myself, while violating her explicit intentions to pay Carol's debts would demonstrate caring about family, was so morally backwards that I struggled to respond to such twisted reasoning. My cousin Sarah, who had apparently been coached about what to say during this intervention, delivered what was clearly a prepared emotional appeal designed to make me feel guilty about my grandmother's generous educational gift. "Aunt Carol sacrificed everything to raise you, Kimberly," Sarah said with obvious rehearsal. "And now, when she needs help, you're refusing to share family money that could solve everyone's problems. Grandmother would be heartbroken to see how selfish you've become about money she left to help the family." The complete rewriting of my grandmother's explicit educational intentions to claim that she had left money to help the family, rather than specifically to support my medical training, revealed how thoroughly Carol had distorted the inheritance situation to justify her theft of educational funding. But Carol herself delivered the most manipulative emotional blackmail of the entire intervention, combining false claims about my grandmother's intentions with threats about family relationships that were designed to pressure me into abandoning my educational dreams for the sake of solving her financial problems. "Kimberly, keeping this inheritance will destroy our family forever," Carol announced dramatically, apparently believing that emotional manipulation would succeed where legal pressure had failed. "Your grandmother never intended for money to come between family members, and your selfishness is proving that you care more about money than you care about the people who love you." The suggestion that my grandmother had somehow opposed family financial harmony while simultaneously creating an inheritance specifically designed to support my medical education revealed Carol's complete inability to understand or accept her mother's explicit wishes about educational funding. "If you sign these trust documents, we can all move forward as a loving family," Carol continued, gesturing toward the legal papers that would transfer my inheritance into her control. "But if you continue to be selfish about this money, you'll be choosing wealth over family relationships, and you'll have to live with the consequences of that decision." The ultimatum was clear. Either I violated my grandmother's educational wishes by signing away my inheritance, or Carol would consider me to have chosen money over family and would presumably cut off our relationship entirely. But as I sat in that chair surrounded by family members and hired attorneys who were all pressuring me to steal from my grandmother's educational legacy, I realized that Carol had made a crucial miscalculation about both my legal preparation and my commitment to honoring my grandmother's explicit wishes about supporting medical education. Have you ever been surrounded by family members and hired attorneys who were all demanding that you commit inheritance fraud while claiming their demands represented love and family unity? That's exactly what I was experiencing, but it was also exactly what would trigger the comprehensive legal response that I had prepared for this exact scenario. Carol's elaborate inheritance theft scheme was about to discover that I hadn't come to this ambush alone. The moment when I would turn Carol's elaborate inheritance theft scheme against itself arrived when I looked around the room at the family members and hired attorneys who were all demanding that I violate my grandmother's educational wishes, smiled confidently, and announced the words that would transform their coordinated pressure campaign into their own comprehensive legal education about inheritance fraud and elder law violations. "This is all very interesting," I said calmly, reaching into my briefcase while maintaining eye contact with Carol and her hired attorneys. But I have to say, I didn't come alone either. The confident smile that had been on Carol's face immediately disappeared as she realized that her carefully planned ambush was about to be countered by something she hadn't anticipated or prepared for, while her hired attorneys exchanged uncomfortable glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that their client might have misrepresented the legal situation they were being paid to support. "I brought my own legal team," I continued, pulling out my phone to send a text message that would summon the inheritance protection specialists who had been waiting in the parking lot for exactly this moment. "And they've been very busy documenting Carol's attempts to steal my inheritance through fraud, coercion, and elder law violations." The word fraud caused immediate alarm among Carol's hired attorneys, who clearly understood that inheritance fraud was a serious federal crime that could result in both criminal prosecution and professional sanctions for attorneys who participated in illegal inheritance pressure schemes. "What legal team?" Carol asked, her voice rising with panic as she realized that her inheritance theft scheme was about to face professional legal opposition rather than just family pressure and emotional manipulation. Attorney Patricia Williams from Williams & Associates, elder law specialist Dr. Michael Rodriguez, and forensic accountant Jennifer Martinez, I replied, enjoying the growing alarm on Carol's face as she began to understand that her inheritance theft attempt was about to be challenged by professionals who specialized in protecting educational bequests from family pressure campaigns. The front door opened to admit my legal team, who entered the living room with the professional confidence and comprehensive documentation that would soon expose Carol's inheritance fraud scheme, while demonstrating the serious legal penalties for attempting to steal educational money through family pressure and attorney intimidation. "Good evening, everyone," Attorney Patricia Williams announced as she set up her own conference materials that would counter every aspect of Carol's inheritance theft documentation. "I'm Patricia Williams, representing Kimberly Hayes in matters related to inheritance protection and elder law compliance. We've been investigating attempted inheritance fraud and coercion targeting Ms. Hayes' educational bequest." The mention of inheritance fraud and coercion caused Carol's attorneys to immediately begin distancing themselves from their client, clearly understanding that they had been hired to participate in potentially criminal activity that could jeopardize their professional licenses and legal standing. Dr. Rodriguez is our elder law specialist who has been reviewing the testamentary documents and inheritance restrictions that govern Ms. Hayes' educational bequest, Patricia continued, gesturing toward the professional who would soon explain why Carol's family trust scheme violated multiple aspects of inheritance law and elder protection regulations. Ms. Martinez is our forensic accountant, who has been documenting the financial pressure tactics and documenting Ms. Hayes' inheritance protection requirements, Patricia concluded, indicating the specialist who had been building a comprehensive case against Carol's attempted inheritance theft. Dr. Michael Rodriguez stepped forward to address Carol's inheritance theft scheme directly, using his expertise in elder law and inheritance protection to explain why her family trust arrangement violated both legal requirements and ethical obligations related to respecting testamentary wishes. "Mrs. Hayes, the inheritance your daughter received is governed by explicit testamentary language that prohibits the kind of redistribution you're attempting to force through this family pressure campaign," Dr. Rodriguez announced, spreading out legal documents that demonstrated my grandmother's specific educational intentions and the legal protections that prevented family interference. Eleanor Hayes was very specific about designating this inheritance exclusively for Kimberly's medical education and professional development, Dr. Rodriguez continued, reading directly from my grandmother's will to counter Carol's false claims about family inheritance rights. The legal language explicitly prohibits using these funds for general family financial assistance, debt payments, or any purpose other than supporting Kimberly's medical career. The reading of my grandmother's actual testamentary language immediately exposed the fraudulent nature of Carol's claims about family money and what grandmother really wanted. while demonstrating that her pressure campaign was designed to violate explicit inheritance restrictions. Carol's hired attorneys were beginning to understand that they had been recruited to participate in inheritance fraud based on false information about my grandmother's wishes and my legal obligations, making their continued participation potentially criminal rather than just professionally questionable. We were not informed about specific testamentary restrictions on inheritance use, Attorney Robert Martinez said, clearly trying to distance himself from Carol's fraud scheme while protecting his professional reputation. Our client indicated that this was a standard family inheritance that could be restructured through normal trust arrangements. That's not accurate, forensic accountant Jennifer Martinez replied, producing comprehensive documentation of Carol's inheritance fraud scheme and the illegal pressure tactics she had been using to steal educational money. We have recorded conversations where Mrs. Hayes acknowledged her mother's educational intentions while explicitly planning to violate those wishes for her own financial benefit. The mention of recorded conversations caused panic among both Carol and her hired attorneys, who were suddenly realizing that their inheritance theft scheme had been comprehensively documented and that their attempts to steal educational money constituted criminal activity with serious legal consequences. Recorded conversations? Carol asked, her voice shaking as she began to understand that her inheritance fraud attempts had been legally documented rather than remaining private family pressure that couldn't be proven in court. Multiple recorded conversations where you acknowledged that your mother left this inheritance specifically for Kimberly's medical education while planning to steal it for your own debt payments, Jennifer Martinez replied, playing back audio recordings that would soon destroy any remaining credibility for Carol's inheritance theft scheme. The first recording was Carol's voice clearly stating her understanding of my grandmother's educational intentions while planning to violate those wishes. I know Mom wanted that money for Kimberly's medical school, but $1 million could solve all my financial problems. I just need to convince her that family needs are more important than what some dead person wanted. The second recording was even more damaging. I've hired attorneys to pressure Kimberly into signing over her inheritance. If we can make it look like proper legal procedure, she'll probably cave rather than fighting the whole family. Once I control that money, I can pay off my debts and give her whatever I think she needs for school. The third recording provided evidence of criminal conspiracy. We need everyone to pressure Kimberly at the same time so she feels overwhelmed and just signs the papers. The attorneys say if we call it a family trust, it sounds legitimate, even though I'll be the only one making decisions about the money. Have you ever watched someone's inheritance fraud scheme collapse as their own recorded admissions played back to a room full of witnesses and legal professionals? That's exactly what was happening as Carol's theft attempt was exposed through her own documented statements about stealing educational money for debt payments. The recorded evidence of Carol's inheritance fraud was about to trigger criminal referrals and professional sanctions that would make her inheritance theft attempt far more expensive than simply accepting my grandmother's educational wishes. The comprehensive legal consequences that unfolded as my team presented evidence of Carol's inheritance fraud scheme created immediate chaos in the room, as Carol's hired attorneys realized they had been recruited to participate in criminal activity, while family members who had been pressuring me to sign away my inheritance suddenly understood that they had been manipulated into supporting illegal theft of educational money. The recorded conversations proving Carol's criminal intent and deliberate planning to steal my inheritance through fraudulent family pressure had immediate and devastating effects on everyone who had participated in her inheritance theft scheme, as the legal professionals present began to understand the serious criminal and civil penalties they were all facing. Attorney Robert Martinez was the first of Carol's hired attorneys to recognize the legal danger he was facing by participating in inheritance fraud, immediately beginning to distance himself from Carol while attempting to limit his own professional liability for his role in the attempted theft of educational money. We were clearly misinformed about the nature of this inheritance and the client's legal authority to restructure these funds, Martinez announced, gathering his legal documents while avoiding eye contact with Carol. Based on the evidence presented, our firm cannot continue representing interests that appear to conflict with legitimate inheritance law and testamentary wishes. Attorney Jennifer Chen and attorney Michael Thompson quickly followed Martinez's lead, recognizing that their participation in Carol's inheritance fraud scheme could result in professional sanctions, criminal charges, and civil liability that would far exceed any fees they might have earned from their fraudulent client. Our representation of Mrs. Hayes is terminated immediately, Chen announced, clearly trying to create legal distance between herself and Carol's criminal inheritance theft attempt. We were not provided with accurate information about inheritance restrictions or testamentary requirements that govern these funds. The rapid abandonment by her hired legal team left Carol without professional support for her inheritance fraud, while also providing additional evidence that her scheme had been criminal rather than legitimate inheritance planning, as legitimate attorneys would not have withdrawn so quickly from proper legal representation. But the most devastating legal consequence for Carol came when attorney Patricia Williams announced that the evidence of inheritance fraud and elder law violations would be referred to both criminal prosecutors and professional licensing boards that investigated attorney misconduct related to inheritance theft and elder abuse. The recorded evidence of deliberate inheritance fraud, combined with the attempted coercion of an inheritance beneficiary, constitutes multiple violations of both criminal law and elder protection statutes, Patricia announced, producing legal documents that would initiate formal proceedings against Carol and potentially against the attorneys who had participated in her scheme. Mrs. Hayes, you are facing potential charges of inheritance fraud, attempted theft, elder law violations, and conspiracy to commit inheritance crimes, Patricia continued, reading from criminal referral documents that would soon involve federal prosecutors who specialized in inheritance fraud and family financial abuse cases. The mention of federal criminal charges caused Carol to finally understand that her inheritance theft attempt would have consequences far beyond family relationship problems, to include potential prison sentences and permanent criminal records that would affect her for the rest of her life. Criminal charges? Carol asked, her voice barely above a whisper as the reality of her legal situation began to sink in. I was just trying to help the family with financial problems. How can helping family be criminal? Attempting to steal inheritance money through fraud and coercion is a serious federal crime regardless of family relationships or claimed financial need, Dr. Michael Rodriguez replied, explaining the elder law protections that made Carol's inheritance theft attempt a criminal enterprise rather than legitimate family financial planning. Your mother's inheritance was legally protected specifically to prevent the kind of family pressure and fraudulent appropriation that you attempted through this coordinated scheme, Rodriguez continued, documenting the comprehensive legal violations that Carol had committed while trying to steal educational money for debt payments. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of Carol's legal education came when my forensic accountant Jennifer Martinez announced that all of Carol's financial records had been subpoenaed and analyzed, revealing additional criminal activity that extended beyond just the attempted inheritance theft to include potential tax fraud and financial misrepresentation. Our financial investigation has revealed that Mrs. Hayes has been claiming false deductions, misrepresenting income sources, and potentially committing tax fraud that will require additional criminal referrals, Martinez announced, producing comprehensive financial documentation that would support additional charges against Carol's systematic dishonesty. The family members who had participated in Carol's pressure campaign were also facing potential legal consequences for their role in the attempted inheritance fraud, as their coordinated efforts to pressure me into signing away my inheritance constituted criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate family concern. Uncle Tom, Aunt Patricia, and the other family members who participated in this pressure campaign may face charges as accessories to inheritance fraud, Patricia Williams explained, causing immediate panic among relatives who had believed they were helping with family financial planning rather than participating in criminal theft of educational money. The legal consequences would extend beyond just criminal charges to include civil penalties and potential forfeiture of any money or property that Carol might have received if her inheritance theft scheme had succeeded, ensuring that attempted inheritance fraud carried comprehensive financial accountability. But the most meaningful outcome of exposing Carol's inheritance fraud was the complete legal protection of my grandmother's educational bequest, with court orders and legal documentation that would prevent any future attempts to steal or redirect money that had been specifically designated for my medical education and professional development. Ms. Hayes's inheritance is now protected by comprehensive legal documentation that prevents any future family pressure or attempted theft, Patricia Williams announced, producing court orders that would make my educational inheritance legally untouchable, regardless of any financial crises or family pressure that might arise in the future. The emergency family meeting that Carol had organized to steal my inheritance had instead become her comprehensive education about inheritance law and the serious criminal penalties for attempting to defraud educational bequests through family pressure and attorney intimidation. 6 months after Carol's failed inheritance fraud scheme, I was thriving in my first year of medical school at Johns Hopkins, using my grandmother's educational bequest exactly as she had intended, while Carol faced ongoing criminal prosecution and permanent damage to her reputation and family relationships. Carol's attempted inheritance theft had resulted in federal charges for inheritance fraud, elder law violations, and conspiracy, leading to a plea agreement that included 2 years of federal probation, mandatory financial counseling, and restitution payments that would continue for years after her probation ended. The attorneys who had participated in Carol's fraud scheme faced professional sanctions from the State Bar Association, including temporary license suspensions and mandatory ethics training that would permanently affect their legal careers and professional reputations. My medical education was proceeding exactly as my grandmother had envisioned, with her generous inheritance providing comprehensive support for tuition, living expenses, research opportunities, and the financial independence that would allow me to choose medical specialties based on passion rather than debt service requirements. Your grandmother's educational investment is creating exactly the kind of positive impact she intended, wrote Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of Medical Student Affairs at Johns Hopkins. Students with comprehensive financial support like yours are able to focus entirely on learning and patient care rather than worrying about debt, which typically produces better physicians who are more committed to serving underserved populations. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome of successfully protecting my inheritance was the establishment of the Eleanor Hayes Educational Protection Foundation, a legal advocacy organization that helps other students whose family members attempt to steal educational inheritance through pressure campaigns and fraudulent schemes. The Hayes case has become an important precedent for protecting educational inheritance from family fraud and ensuring that testamentary wishes about educational support are respected regardless of family financial pressure, explained Professor Michael Rodriguez from the law school's Elder Law Clinic. The foundation provides legal representation and financial support for students whose educational inheritance has been threatened by family members who view educational money as family resources that should be redistributed according to immediate financial needs rather than long-term educational investment. 5 years after my grandmother's death and Carol's failed inheritance theft, I graduated from medical school debt-free and began my residency in pediatric medicine, exactly as my grandmother had hoped when she designated her life savings to support my medical education and professional independence. Carol's comfortable suburban lifestyle had been replaced by financial restrictions and professional limitations that reflected her criminal conviction for inheritance fraud, while the credit card debts that had motivated her theft attempt remained unpaid and continued to damage her financial standing. The family relationships that Carol had claimed would be destroyed forever if I kept my inheritance had indeed been permanently altered, but not because I had chosen money over family. Rather because Carol had chosen criminal fraud over respecting her mother's educational wishes and her daughter's legitimate inheritance rights. My grandmother's educational bequest had not only supported my medical training, but had also created legal precedents and advocacy resources that would protect other students from family members who attempt to steal educational inheritance for their own financial benefit. If you're a student whose educational inheritance has been threatened by family pressure or fraudulent schemes, Please know that comprehensive legal protections exist to preserve educational money for its intended purpose while holding criminals accountable for attempted inheritance theft. Document any family pressure or threats related to your educational inheritance. Consult with attorneys who specialize in inheritance protection and elder law, and don't hesitate to pursue criminal charges when family members attempt to steal money that was specifically designated for your educational future. Have you ever had family members organize pressure campaigns to steal educational money while claiming their theft would represent family unity? How do you protect educational inheritance from relatives who view student money as family resources that should be redistributed? Your experience might help other students facing similar inheritance pressure and family fraud. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Remember that educational inheritance represents individual opportunity and generational investment that deserves protection from family members who would steal student money for their own financial benefit. Sometimes the greatest revenge against inheritance fraud is ensuring that educational money serves its intended purpose, while criminals face comprehensive legal consequences for their attempted theft. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.